Good morning, everybody. My name is Nikki MacDonald from the Financial Planning Institute. I am the head of certification and standards there. And I want to say thank you for joining us this morning for Money Smart Week. It is a national incentive of the National NCFIC. We call them the National Committee for Financial Education in South Africa. We resort under the National Treasury, and therefore we partake in Money Smart Week every year. Now, why we are here this morning is to discuss the two-part system, which will be in effect technically from Sunday this week. I can't believe we're already there. And today we have got one of our certified financial planners, Gareth Collier, here with us to discuss the two-part system and the impact it will have on your retirement with you. So Gareth is a practicing financial planner at Crew Invest in Cape Town. Crew Invest won our Professional Practice of the Year award last year. So you really do know that if you're getting some advice from them, it will be good advice. And also Gareth partook in our Financial Planner of the Year competition this year, and he was one of the 3 finalists. So you really do know that you're in good hands. Gareth, I'm going to give over to you. I will ask that everybody asks questions by popping it in the chat and the Q&A as we go along, and we will answer those questions at the end of the session if you're comfortable with that, Gareth.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No.
Okay. Over to you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, great. No, thank you very much, Nikki, and thank you everyone for taking the time to join us this morning. We're really here to talk through the specifics of this sort of imminent two-part system launching. So this is really an opportunity to kind of iron out any questions that you might have. I've obviously put a bit of a presentation, a bit of an agenda together. But yeah, this is really a session for you guys. So please don't worry about at the end. If we're running out of time, I'll definitely get to all the questions. Let me just start by putting up the screen. Nikki, can you just give me a thumbs up that you can see it there?
It is perfect.
Fantastic. Okay, so like I said, the point of today's session is to have a look at how the two-part system is going to work, and really what is the intention. So we've given a bit of a heading there saying trying to balance retirement outcomes with also having a lifeline for emergencies. So what is that going to mean? Well, we're first going to look at, why have a two-part system, and as well as what are those desired outcomes. Then we're going to have a look at a little bit of the legislation and say, how is it going to be implemented? When is this going to come into effect? Like Nikki's kind of mentioned already. And then we're going to look at some practical examples. So let's look at how a newer fund member is going to be impacted by this two-part system, as well as maybe in general some of the older existing fund members who you're going to kind of engage with as planners out there. How is this going to impact their retirement funding and planning looking forward? Then just looking at some little discussion points, so really how would you possibly go about explaining this to a client? And then what are some of the potential benefits of having this new system, as well as the risk to those members if they don't understand fully how the two-part system is going to work? So really, let's start with the introduction. So where does this two-part system kind of come from? So I think really the intention is to ideally have a system in place that we can address and improve retirement outcomes in South Africa. We know that we don't have a great savings culture here, and we know that we don't have a widespread capacity or ability from most people to retire and retire successfully from a financial perspective, i.e., do they have enough to actually retire on one day? So where the two-part system actually came about, it's almost like a bit of an outcome from the COVID lockdown pandemic from a few years ago. Before the pandemic, one of the objectives was initially government was sort of looking at a solution. We said, look, we're not actually going to give people any access to their retirement funds before the actual retirement date. Obviously, COVID happened. There were lockdowns, and I think there was a realization that we can't just take away people's access from this money, because there might be very genuine sort of emergencies that might happen that nobody can reasonably predict. So having these two-pot accesses is to balance a need for emergency access, but also kind of have a disciplined approach to that long-term funding. So, and really, even without the sort of COVID pandemic, one of the big issues even before that, and it still continues today, was the practice of people unfortunately getting into financial situations where they face a lot of debt, and then seeing it as a viable solution to resign from their employer, cash in their pension or provident funds, pay the tax, settle off the debt. But obviously the way, that felt like a very good short-term step to get themselves from under the weight and the pressure of debt repayments. But it did mean that you are now stepping away from your employment, and there's no guarantee that you're going to find other alternative employment. So really trying to curb that practice. So if we look at the legislation, right? So let's look at the specifics now. So we know that the implementation date is confirmed for 1 September. So that's Sunday this week. What does that mean for all of the retirement funds? Well, what they're going to have to do is they're now going to have to split the existing savings that are in place. So all the accumulated benefits within your retirement funds up to the 31st of August, what the administrator is going to do, let me just make sure I've got a pointer here. So what the administrator is going to do is they're going to do a one-time sort of compulsory transfer, or they're calling it seeding capital, into what's going to be the new savings pot. Okay, that transfer is going to be the lesser or the lower of 10% of your actual benefit or actual accumulated fund, or 30,000 Rand, whichever is the lower of the two. Anything remaining above that is going to go into what they're calling a vested pot, okay? So, or a vested component. And what that very simply means is that any money in your vested component will still retain all of the rules that are in place as we are today, okay? And carrying forward. So very simply, that means if you leave your employer, you still retain the option to stay in that fund as a paid up member. You can still take that money in cash, subject to tax, or you can transfer it to another fund. Okay, so either a personal preservation fund or to a new employer fund. Okay, you will have that flexibility with the vested pot. So all the rules as they are now continue forward. The contributions from effectively Monday onwards, it's going to be a case of where your retirement contributions are now going to be split 1/3, 2/3. 1/3 is going to go into the new savings component. 2/3 is going to go into the retirement component. Okay, so if we look very high level quickly, the savings component, this is going to be a pot to a component where the money is accessible before you retire. Okay, you also don't have to now resign from your employer to make an access from those funds. Your retirement component, however, is going to receive the 2/3 contribution, but you cannot touch this money before retirement, right? So that includes when you leave your employer through a resignation, also if there's a retrenchment, right? It's going to be inaccessible, okay? It's probably best to look at some examples to see how this is going to work. So if we focus on what's going to happen with the vested component, that's split at inception. So here we have somebody who's got 150,000 Rand in their savings, their retirement fund, on the 31st of August, and they're making a monthly contribution of 900 Rand. So on 31 August, what the administrator is going to do is they're going to say, right, well, 10% of the 150 is 15,000. That is going to be transferred to the new savings component as a one-time seeding capital. So to be clear, this is not going to be an annual split. It is a one-time only event for those with existing retirement funds. Then that 10% has gone into the savings component. The 135,000 remaining balance, that is now going to sit in that invested or that vested component. So it'll still be invested as it is now. It's still going to continue to move around, grow with markets over time. But in terms of the accessibility rights, you will retain all of those moving forward. The savings component, so here it's going to receive the one-time seeding funding, depending on the value in the accumulated fund, as well as 1/3 of the monthly contribution. So in this example of the 900, 300 Rand is going to go into the savings component, and the 2/3 contribution of 600 is going to go into the retirement component. Note the retirement component starts with a 0 balance. Okay, so there's no seeding capital or anything like that for, for that particular fund or component. So just looking at a slightly different example in terms of the limits on this seeding transfer. So here we have somebody who's got 500,000 Rand in their retirement fund at the 31st of August. 10% of that would be 50. However, it's capped at the lower, which is the 30,000. So here only the 30,000 would be put into the savings component, right, as a once-off seeding capital, and the 470 is then going to move into the vested pot, right? So just to recap and be clear, in terms of the vested component, right, if you leave your employer, i.e. resignation, dismissal, retrenchment, all your rights and accesses remain as they are now. Okay, so none of that changes. When you retire, you will still be subject to the T-Day rules, but you know, your vested component, depending on the nature, maybe there's some historical provident fund access there, depending on your age, you know, will determine if you can take 100%. If it's coming from a pension fund, that's going to be 1/3 in cash, 2/3 to the annuity. If it is a retirement annuity, same as the pension fund, 1/3 in cash and 2/3 goes into an annuity. Okay, any of the cash components taken is going to be taxed on the retirement tax table, you know, so barring you never having made a withdrawal before, that first 550,000 currently is going to be taxed at 0%, and then the balance of the table is going to be applied above that. Okay, if we look at the savings component, okay, as we mentioned earlier, 1/3 of all future contributions is going into the savings component, and this is the money that is going to form the accessible cash component at retirement as well. Okay, so not only is it the portion that you can access pre-retirement, but at retirement, this is going to be the only pot or the only component that you actually have access to in cash, right? The retirement component, which is receiving the 2/3, there's going to be 0 cash access at retirement. The full amount will have to be annuitized. Okay. So if we look at the two-pot, say the savings component access, right? So as I mentioned, this is effectively going to become your 1/3 access at retirement. So whatever's in the savings component at retirement, you then have the option to say, look, I would like to take all of it. I'd like to only take a portion of it, like you would now, sort of within the realms of that 1/3 access. Pre-retirement, it's very important to note that you're only going to have one access per tax year, not calendar year, per tax year, okay? If you make an access in a particular month, it is not now a rolling 12 months that you have to wait for a future access. It goes in line with the tax year. So for example, if you drew some money out in December, you don't now have to wait till the following December to make an access. You simply would have to wait till the following March when the new tax year opens up and you can access again, okay? But it is one time per year. So if your client goes and accesses money in the March, and December rolls around and they're desperate for more money, unfortunately, there's just simply no accessibility once you've made that one-time withdrawal. As you can see here, the minimum withdrawal is going to be 2,000 Rand. Okay, that is the gross amount before any tax or fees have been applied. Okay, and on the point of tax, it's very important to note that whatever gets taken out will be taxed at that person's current marginal tax rate. Okay, so one way to think of it is it's basically like taking out or earning extra income in that tax year. Okay, it gets added over and above your your taxable earnings. So it's going to be important to know what that marginal rate is when you're making such a decision. Okay, like we've said, you're not going to have to now resign from your employer to have access to these funds. And really the last point is kind of where we get involved from a planning and advisory standpoint is to help people that we should really only consider this in genuine financial emergencies. Okay, it's just because it's called a savings pot or a savings component, people should really not try and think of it as a savings account that you should be accessing. Okay. Flipping the focus now onto the retirement component. Okay, obviously a lot less complicated, but in essence, it's going to receive 2/3 of all the contributions. Okay, there's going to be zero withdrawal access before retirement. Okay, there are caveats to this. Obviously, if you immigrate and you do the 3-year sort of waiting period, that's going to allow you to access it if you break tax residency, if you get divorced, if you owe SARS money, those accesses haven't been taken away. But in essence, for the average person who's going to move through their career into retirement, no access before then. Okay. And like I said, when you do retire, all of the funds here must be used to invest in an annuity. So what will happen? Okay, well, as I mentioned, if you withdrawal options, so if you leave your employer, that's resignation, dismissal, retrenchment, there is no access. Okay, all of the money would have to be preserved. So like we mentioned earlier, that can be an in-fund paid-up member where you are currently. You could possibly transfer to a new employer fund, or you could simply put it into a preservation fund of your own. Okay. On retirement, as I mentioned, all of the money does need to be used to go into a pension, right? To create an annuity so that you have a cash flow. The only time that this is going to be permissible to be taken to cash is if it falls below the 165,000 Rand minimum balance. Then they will allow you to take all the money in cash. Okay, so that's the legislation and all the rules and things. Let's look at a practical example. So here we have Thandi. She is a 29-year-old sort of newly qualified professional. She's a new fund member, right? So she has zero retirement funds up to this point, okay? No retirement funds to consider. So she starts work on Monday, so from effectively the 1st of September. It's the first time she's ever joined a fund. Immediately, all of her contributions are going to be subject to the two-pot system. Okay. Now, 8 years down the road, she's accumulated 200,000 Rand in the savings component or the savings pot. So the benefits here is that, one, the funds are available if needed. Okay. And she doesn't have to resign from her employer to get that access. Okay. The thing she needs to look at, though, is that any withdrawal that she does choose to take is going to be taxed at her marginal tax rate. And the other part is also to be aware of the fact that you are now reducing your accessible cash at retirement. So not just the accessible cash, but what is the impact going to be on that lost accumulated investment growth? So possibly from a planning perspective, when we're engaging with Thandi around this decision, we say, okay, fine, well, what is your marginal tax rate versus, let's say, the interest rate that you're paying on your debt? If you are a high earner and you're paying sort of 41, 45% marginal tax and your interest rate is, say, 20%, does it make sense to use this money? If it does, the other thing is, are your tax affairs in order? Because what's going to happen is once you trigger any of these savings component withdrawal requests, once you put that instruction through, it cannot be stopped. Okay, so it can't be so the client or yourself, you're going to have to make sure that there aren't any outstanding taxes that you're not aware of that's going to be deducted from the savings fund withdrawal, and now you've possibly undercated for that. You can't go back and make another withdrawal to make up for it, or you simply now effectively losing out more cash over tax and outstate taxes that you were planning, and you would rather have made it an alternative arrangement. So, we've really got to look at it and say, okay, fine, is this a genuine financial emergency? And discuss through how is this going to affect your long-term retirement funding and planning, i.e. your access to cash at retirement, as well as your lost investment growth, and then really kind of talk through, are there possibly any alternative options? Okay. So if we now fast forward and we look at Tandi's access at her retirement one day, now she's 65, so she's worked sort of diligently, she's had a successful career, and although she's been consistently contributing to her fund, there have been, life happens, there's been several instances of her needing to access the savings component over the years. So here we say, okay, fine. If we look back to our earlier thing, at 37, yes, she did take that 200,000, and along the way, she's had other accesses as well. And now when she's retiring, she's got 800,000 Rand left in her savings component and 6 million Rand in her retirement component. So what are her options? Because she would like to take all the cash available. She's worked really, really hard. She would like to have as much money in her pocket as possible because she wants to enjoy her life, have a few adventures. So if we look at, well, what is the impact of her previous withdrawals, okay, on her accessible retirement lump sum? Well, none, because like we mentioned, the accesses and the withdrawals from the savings component is going to be taxed at her marginal rate, right, at the time that she takes the withdrawal. So in the current system now, where we've got to look at it and we've got to, understand what the implementation is going to be on your let's say your tax-free portion at retirement one day, that becomes less of an impact because the tax has already been resolved in the moment. So if we look at, well, what can she access at retirement? As I mentioned, it's going to be only the accumulated savings component. So here, sort of comparatively, she's got much, much less in her savings component at 200,000 versus the 6 million in her annuity. I mean, in her retirement component. So the savings component would be fully accessible, okay, at retirement. That would be taxed on the retirement tax table. Okay, so whatever the tax table rates are at that time, that is going to apply. The retirement component, well, we can only use that to create an annuity to provide income. So whether that's a living or a life annuity or a combination of the two, that is going to be our only option with that portion. So if we look now at another example, so here we've got Derek. Derek is 53 years old. Understandably, he's he's nearing retirement now. So how's the two-pot going to impact on him? So he's already a current member of his employer's pension fund. And on 1 September, his active fund is now going to be subject to the two-pot reallocation. Okay. So at the end of August, he had accumulated 3 million Rand in his company pension fund. He's got a 400,000 Rand Provident Preservation Fund, as well as a 1 million Rand Pension Preservation Fund, both privately invested. So how is the two-pot going to apply? Well, if we look at his company pension fund, his company retirement fund, so the two-pot split is going to apply. So they're going to say the savings pot, well, that's going to receive the lesser of 10% or 30,000. So that's going to receive 30,000 Rand. Obviously 10% would be 300, so far in excess of that. So his savings component will have a seeding funding of 30,000 plus 1/3 of all of his future contributions to his pension fund. The vested pot, Well, that's going to have the 3 million less the 30,000 that's being used as the vesting capital. So 2.97 million will sit in his vested pot or his vested component. And the retirement pot or component is going to start with a zero balance, but it's now going to receive 2/3 of all of his future contributions. The preservation funds, well, they're not going to be impacted at all. Remember, the nature of a preservation fund is that you're holding all the vested rights that you received at the point of implementation. Those can't simply be wiped away, so those will continue forward as they are now. So now we fast forward a couple of years. Derek is now 65. He's ready to retire. And he also feels like he would like to try and get as much cash as possible. Now we look at it and say, well, what could he draw? So on the company retirement fund, well, we now know that the savings pot is going to be 100% accessible in cash, all right? The vested pot, so the money that was side portioned out of the pension fund, well, he's still going to have that 1/3 access of whatever happens to be the balance in there at the point of retirement. However, the retirement pot, no access to cash. All of that will need to be used to form or create an annuity together with the 2/3 from the vested pot. If we look at his preservation funds, well, the Provident Preservation Fund, that's still 100% accessible. He carried forward those vested rights. So if he would like, he could draw it fully in cash. And the Pension Preservation Fund is again going to be 1/3 of that in cash is accessible. The 2/3 would have to then go into the annuity. Okay. So if we look at some general considerations in terms of how this new system is going to impact retirement funding. So we look at how it's going to impact on trustees, right? And the decisions that they're going to have to make in terms of default fund selections. Because remember, although there are these different pots and components and vested rights and that sort of thing within the fund, it's still a single investment. Okay, the different pots really just simply means what accessibility rights do I have to that portion of this investment. So now it's going to be a case of, well, how do we balance the need to make sure that we're investing appropriately for long term, for retirement, to have real capital growth on these things, as well as needing to understand there are going to be ad hoc accesses to these retirement, to these savings, to the savings components, and we simply don't know when, how often, what are the trends going to be. Then we've got to look at it and say, well, okay, fine, are all savings pot accesses bad, right? Like I mentioned earlier, life does happen, all right? We know it's not a simple mathematical straight line as much as we'd love it to be. So when you're engaging with clients, I think it's important. Some people can feel a little bit kind of negative towards the decisions they're having to make, and really our job and role is to help them understand that, like, well, as long as you're not drawing from these things to maybe make impulsive decisions or purchases that possibly don't have much genuine value, and there are genuine emergencies, it could be a good thing, being now that you don't have to resign from your employment to access these monies. Okay. Over time, and if we look at what's happened in the last few years with all the fund harmonizations and that, the idea is that for investors, for consumers, the accessibility and the rules around the different retirement funds is going to be a lot less confusing, a lot more uniform. So if you look at, like Tandy in our example, somebody who's had no legacy, no retirement funds pre-two-pot, they should technically be able to move from their employer, let's say retirement fund, whether it's a provident or a pension, they move to a new employer, that employer doesn't have a company pension fund, they should be able to move from the employer fund to a retirement annuity because the accessibility rights are still the same. Then they join a new employer that does have a fund, they should be able to pull that retirement annuity into the employer's fund, because all the rules and accessibilities are going to be the same. We're not going to have to say, are you moving from a more restrictive to a less restrictive or vice versa, and is it going to be allowed? We need to then obviously have the conversation around liquidity in retirement. A lot of people, will assume that because they have some cash access at retirement, that's going to help them have that additional liquidity outside of their annuity income or their pension income. With this new system in place now, if you are ill-disciplined about drawing out your savings component, you really, really are going to sort of back yourself into a corner in terms of your liquidity and access to cash at and into retirement. If now you've drawn down all of your savings component, you've maybe got a very large annuity that you're going to be earning and the income is there, but it doesn't give you a lot of flexibility. As we mentioned, just because you're into retirement now doesn't mean life all becomes smooth and easy sailing. And that sort of covers all of the official slides. I'd like to check if there's any questions in that, or if I need to go back to anything. I hope I didn't go through it too quickly. Nikki, sorry, I'm just trying to get my screen back here.
Yes, Gareth, I just want to comment here. I see Marcus added something.
Yes.
Just about members that are aged 55 plus on T-Day. And T-Day was obviously the 1st of March 2021. What will happen to them?
Sorry, let's bring it back here. So those members who were 55 and over, two-pot is not an auto inclusion. They will have to specifically choose to partake. They will need to give that instruction. If they decide that it's not for them, that they are not going to be automatically enrolled into the two-pot structure.
So from a practical perspective, speaking about people who are that age, not everybody chooses to, retire at 55. I mean, most people, we also advise, unless you're in a very good financial position, it is rather a fact that you have to work a little bit longer, maybe to age 65 and maybe even beyond that. So it might be worth for some of these people to actually partake in two-pot, where if you're closer to retirement, maybe it wouldn't. I don't know if you can maybe talk me through some scenarios in those cases that you see happening.
I think with this thing rolling out now, we realize that we can start to get a little bit, I wouldn't say creative, but thinking out these situations, and particularly because of the way the taxation is going to work. If you take the existing approach, any cash you take out is explicitly taxed as either a withdrawal tax table or retirement tax table. By throwing in the savings component, if somebody is going to draw money out and they were going to pay, let's say, an 18 or 27% flat rate on the retirement tax table, now all of a sudden we can play around and say, okay, hang on, can we draw more at a lower tax rate by using your marginal tax rate, particularly once you go over the age of 65 and you get now you're getting your additional tax rebates. So, for those who are disciplined, I think having the accessibility on the savings component is going to be great. If you really engage with your planning and you think through your options and that, I think it's going to work really, really well. If you're over 55, even if you are 61 and you're planning on retiring at 65, I don't actually see any downside in those people participating. Because just because you have access pre-retirement doesn't mean that you have a gun to your head saying you have to draw out. So it's actually a neutral position if you are a very disciplined saver. What it does do, though, is it just gives you that flexibility, because you never know. You might be 61 saying I'm retiring at 65. I don't need to participate, but you don't know what the next 4 years holds in store for you. And you might just want that little sort of safety net to say, right, if I do need access, I do have it. I don't have to resign. I don't have to retire, et cetera, et cetera. So I do think it's going to bring a lot more flexibility.
So there's another interesting question here. What is going to be the impact of this two-pot system? How is it going to affect the sustainability of retirement funds in South Africa?
Yeah. So I think the asset managers are all excited because, it's that they can almost do some reasonable forecasting now, knowing that, hey, the money within the funds, okay, let's ignore transfers and things out of the funds, but the money in the system is now all of a sudden, we know that, let's say, two-thirds of it is locked in pretty much across somebody's lifetime, because it's not just going to be the pre-retirement, but the post-retirement when you're drawing down as well. So having a much higher baseline to work off. So I kind of say, like, I think the outcomes is not necessarily going to raise the ceiling, for individuals in that, because I think for people who were always disciplined savers, this is kind of a neutral impact. What it's going to do, though, it's going to lift the floor, in terms of the people that were drawing all the money out, pulling the money out of that system, going into the consumerism, and not having that kind of real baseline of capital that we know is going to be accumulating over time.
Absolutely. I had the
Mm,
discussion with my oldest son is 20, he's turning 22 in a month's
mm,
time.
mhm.
And he's just started his first job. And his first proper job. And if I look at what his retirement is going to look like versus what most of the people in South Africa, and we know there's an issue, retirements are looking at like at this point, I can actually really see enormous benefits in this
Yeah.
because he will not be able to access anything except the savings pot over his lifetime. So there's a guaranteed two-thirds waiting for him at the end. And I think that is, although, the rules might be different and some people might be hesitant, I think in the long run, this is going to be a much more secure
Mm,
system for South
mm.
Africans, which is going to look after them when they need looking after. So
Yeah.
I'm very excited about the
Mm.
system. I think it's a
And
good
just
move.
a quick point on that as well. I think part of people's hesitation sometimes for putting money into a retirement fund is they say, look, we love the tax deductibility, but we worry about the accessibility. Now you can really get the best, largely speaking, you can get the best of both worlds. Because again, if you were to say, look, I need to accumulate some cash on the side, you're paying your marginal tax rate anyway. Now you can almost kind of say, look, I'm going to rather save it at a more tax efficient rate, and I am going to have emergency access if I need it. And the worst case scenario is I'm going to pay the marginal tax that I would have paid anyway. So there's lots of little considerations people can take.
Absolutely.
Mm.
So here is another question. What happens when a member dies before retirement?
Mm. Well, I mean, no change, right? So it's not saying that money is locked away for an explicit period. Remember, it's the member's accessibility pre and post retirement. Death has a zero impact, right? It's still going to be distributed to the beneficiaries. It's still going to be subject to 37C. The trustees are still going to make those those allocations, and the beneficiaries are still going to have the same options that they have right now in terms of how they receive those benefits. So the two part doesn't actually affect death claims.
Then there's an interesting one,
Mm,
and it's one that I think will be fleshed out as we go along with
mm,
the pots. And actually, it's all very new, so you think it's going to work a certain
mm,
way, and then once we get a little bit smarter about it, it might influence the way you actually invest.
mm.
So, should I stick to, and this is, will it influence investment models? Should I in my pension fund stick to the same investment philosophy across both pots, or is there going to be a difference in the investments that you will advise to clients?
Yeah. So I think, like what I mentioned earlier, these aren't two separate funds, right? They're a single investment fund. Okay. They're going to be reported as two different components. And the whole thing is, don't think of it as two separate pots. It is a single investment. This is just accessibility pre and post retirement. That's really what the split is. Okay. So if you think about it, if you said, oh no, no, hang on, I do want to maybe make sure that the savings side is a little bit less aggressively invested than the retirement side. Let's say you do 40% moderately, or 60% moderately aggressive and a 40% conservative, to keep it simple. The problem you face there is you're going to be putting 40% of the retirement component into the conservative model as well. So right now, certainly all the engagements we'd have with all the service providers and that sort of thing, they're not geared or capable of actually treating them as separate investments because they simply aren't. And again, I think the conversation to have with clients in that is that it's a pet peeve of mine. I wish they hadn't called it a savings component. Like with the tax-free accounts, they should never have called them tax-free savings accounts, because as soon as you call something a savings account, people are mentally going to treat it as if it is a savings account. It should really, it's still there for long-term growth. It's still there for retirement funding, all of those kind of long-term outcomes that we're looking for. It's really just the accessibility that we need to realize that we have. And the intention should always be never to touch it. So yes, it should always just be a case of, look, I've hit this roadblock. I really have no other reasonable options that aren't better than going this route. Now I'm going to take an access from the retirement fund. Okay, but your point of departure should always be that this is a retirement investment.
Absolutely. And I want to add a comment to that, and maybe I can ask you for some practical advice, is this should be your absolute last resort if you are looking at withdrawing this. If there is really nothing else left that you can do, this should be the last resort that you look at, because in the end, your retirement annuity or your provident or your pension fund is supposed to give you the security the day when you retire. So emergency funding and building an emergency fund, how important is it in a financial plan? And what type of structures do I use to make sure that I have enough emergency funding available so that I don't have to touch my savings pot?
Yeah, look, I think obviously the simplest thing to do is start with the budget. It's amazing how many people, and I'm not generalizing here. We see clients who are earning insane amounts of money that have no budget. So the budget's important, because you need a budget to be able to say, look, this is actually worst case scenario, what it costs you to keep going on a month-to-month basis, and then how much of that do we need to make provision for. The stuff doesn't have to be overly complicated. It's really just about sitting down and doing it. So having those personal kind of savings accounts, but knowing that you do have this backdoor access. And I think that the decision points around savings accounts, unfortunately, there is no kind of rule of thumb. It's all going to depend on person to person, family to family. That's why we all do personal planning, because if there was a general thing, we could just get a guideline on the internet, everyone could follow it and largely be okay. So it's important to understand your client's needs, what their family needs are, what their family circumstances are. Maybe there are trust funds you're not aware of, anything like that. That's all going to determine what that ultimate savings amount is. But look, a reasonable amount, I don't think that everyone should have, is around about that 3 months of expenses. I think that that pops up time and time again. I think because we see it, that's sort of, with all the debates, that's where the number kind of settles collectively.
Agreed. So Nikesh has a question. Nice to see you in the meeting, Nikesh. Nikesh is one of our candidates. Okay. Going forward, will the client be able to access more than 30K from their savings pot?
Yes. So the 30,000, that is literally a once-off sort of limit that they've put on this seeding capital. There is no limit to how much you can take out. Okay. So like we looked at earlier in the example, Thandi was sort of 8 years in. She had 200,000 Rand in the savings pot. She can take that all out if she chooses.
Then I see Frikky's got his hand up. Frikkie, I did unmute you, so you can unmute yourself from your side and you can then ask us the question.
Thank you so much. Sorry, I'm directly on the website. I don't have the chat function to type the question.
Perfect.
Currently, if your fund is less than 247,500, you can take the whole amount. Is that still going, or is that something that you think is going to be phased out?
Well, no, remember, that's going to carry forward as a vested right. So think about it. So when we change legislation like this, the reason we have vested rights is that you cannot just uniformly go and make sweeping changes to all of the existing stuff, because there's people that have worked through careers, made planning decisions, made decisions in the past based on the rules that they were expecting to be applied in the future. So you can't just throw all of that away. So that's why I say over time, a lot of this is going to work its way through the system, and those will fall away. Much like sort of 10 years ago where we did away with retirement and non-retirement funding income, there are still people that were doing contributions and building funds under that regime who have vested rights. If they haven't accesses, all of those sort of accessibilities are going to carry forward. So the 247,500, let's say, on your vested component will still apply. That figure might change in the future. We would kind of hope that they would, because obviously inflation and market growth and that sort of thing over a long enough period is going to make it irrelevant. But yeah, for all intents and purposes for the near future, that's not going anywhere.
But what I'm specifically talking about now is, let's say somebody with an extremely low type of income, pension fund, retirement annuity, doesn't matter. He contributes something like, and I'm being ridiculous, but let's say 200 Rand a month. Over a 10, 20, 30-year period, if he starts on Monday, currently, do they say anything about, or is there any legislation regarding let's say 20 years from now, he's at 230,000. Would he then be able to access, well, presumably everything if he didn't touch his savings?
So if he's, so going on your example, if he's a brand new person, then only the two-pot legislation is going to apply. And you've then got to look at them separately. Obviously, the savings component, fully cash available. You've then got to look at the retirement component, and currently that needs to be 165 or less to be able to draw it all out.
So if I can add to that, we talk about two pots, but that's two pots going forward from Monday on, or actually from Sunday. There's actually, in some cases, 4 pots. There's the two that's we're talking about now. There's the vested one that is going to be like sort of cut off, created on Sunday night or Saturday night, 12 o'clock. And then there's also if you were in a preservation fund, there's also that pot. So there's quite a few rights that are involved in this, and different types of tax treatment at different points depending on where you came from. So I think, and I'm going to say this a few times before 12 o'clock, speak to a financial planner. If you do not have a financial planner and you need to make these decisions, please go and see someone so they can tell you exactly what your specific situation is. I think it is going to be a minefield going forward. If you do not have the correct advice, you can make decisions that might not be in your best interest. So we are absolutely advocating for every single person in South Africa who's going to make this choice to actually speak to a financial planner or advisor, because what you decide here can really influence what your future self might have going forward. So let's have a look if there's any more questions before we finish off here. A client has around 50,000 in a fund now, but she's not 55 yet, and she has made a policy paid up. Will she have the 10% or 5,000 Rand added to her pot as a one-off?
So remember, it's only for active funds that the split is going to occur. So you've got to think of that as, if that is a paid up contract, it's effectively like a preservation fund. So it is a non-active fund. So that is simply going to be, let's say, vested.
Then here's an interesting question, and something I do not hear everyone talking about. Can you explain the penalty component involved when one withdraws? This person has penalties with SARS. Will they use it to clear my penalties, or can I make arrangements so I can access a portion of my withdrawal?
Yeah. So the basic wording from SARS is that they are going to first claim what they are owed. And if there's any balance left, then there's going to be payments out to you. Obviously, like a lot of these things, I think you should be proactive in engaging with SARS. Can you have a payment arrangement? Can you get a special dispensation from them? Because remember, any of these withdrawals that you make from the savings component is going to require a tax directive. And like any tax directive, the first thing they look at are your tax affairs in order? Because the whole reason for a tax directive is that your your platform, your administrator, is effectively asking SARS's permission, may I pay this person the cash, right? You tell me how much tax is owed due to the withdrawal, and then how much I'm allowed to distribute to them. If there are any penalties or other monies owing, will SARS apply those? My understanding is yes, that they will. And you're going to be kind of left with the balance. That's why I said earlier, be proactive about your questions, because once you initiate the withdrawal from the savings component, there is no stopping it.
Yeah, once that tax directive has been issued, you cannot reverse it. Yeah. Then Jill has a very interesting question. Nice to see you online, Jill. So our neighbors have many citizens who work with SA and belong to our SA funds. How will foreign African fund members who have belonged to a fund for a number of years and to choose to go home before retirement access their income from the retirement pot? Many will not keep their bank accounts open in SA as they no longer work here. How will they access their savings pot?
Yeah, so look, I would kind of say keep those accounts open, because again, under the legislation, it does say that those distributions must go into a South African bank account. No foreign accounts are allowed. No third-party accounts are allowed. So, you can't do somebody a favor by receiving their payout and pay it over to them. So yeah, it does make things complicated for sort of non-residents. Yeah, there is no simple way around it at the moment, other than just having that account open to receive those funds, as well as any of the other components that they might draw out one day. It's the same issue that we've got if somebody immigrates and they do the 3-year sort of holding period. Once they've broken their tax residency, those monies still have to be paid into a bank account in South Africa before they can take the money abroad. So yeah, it's one of those complications that there's no simple way around at the moment.
Then another question, at retirement, will you still be able to access the 550K tax-free amount, the lump sum, despite accessing savings during your working career?
Yeah, so if you're accessing the savings component throughout, remember that's going to be taxed at whatever your marginal tax rate is at the time of making a withdrawal. Once you hit retirement one day, provided that if you've only got 200,000 Rand in that savings component at retirement, it's going to be taxed on what they call the retirement tax table. That's the 550 tax-free or taxed at zero portion. All of that is going to fall within that 550. So currently at the moment, if you resign and you draw your money out, right, there's a bit of a calculation that we have to do at retirement one day that kind of pulls some of that withdrawal and applies it on top of whatever you're taking at retirement to see how much of the 550 you can get tax-free. That sort of calculation is effectively going to fall away with the two-pot implementation, because you've already kind of basically settled your tax obligations every time you've accessed the savings component before retirement. At retirement, you're now allowed to take whatever's in the savings component and tax it on the retirement tax table. Currently, that first 550 is tax-free.
Then I have just got a question, and this has come up quite a bit. If you do decide to actually make a withdrawal, especially in the beginning stages, because next week we don't know, what the numbers of applications are that we're going to get in the industry. How long is it going to take to actually receive your money if you send in an application next week? And I can't answer, but I just want us to manage expectations here, because we've seen changes that involve SARS and retirement funds in the past. And I know from experience that it doesn't always all go smoothly. So, yes.
Yeah, I think that's the best way to mentally approach it. It isn't going to go smoothly, particularly up front. A lot of people, so what we need to understand is there's a couple of things. We all look at SARS and say, oh, the bottleneck's going to come there. They're going to get too many applications. The systems are going to crash. That's quite likely. But also remember, from your administrator, so whoever's holding the account or the investment, the retirement fund that you've got, they still have to do an actuarial calculation in terms of how much is seeding capital, how much is going to savings component, what's going where. They need to do the background work. So probably the simplest way to think of it is, don't think of it like an ATM. It's not, I put in an application and I get cash out. There is a high probability that the platforms themselves will probably still need a couple of days or a week before they can even 100% finalize all the savings components, the vested components. You then put the application in. Simple things that you've got to make sure is that, do they have your tax number? Do they have your up-to-date banking details? Is all your FICA and that sort of thing in place so that they can efficiently distribute those funds? And even then they go to SARS. And then it unfortunately becomes a bit of a roll of the dice at the moment, because we are fully expecting, and everyone's saying it a bit tongue-in-cheek, but it's quite realistic, the platforms know that there's going to be this tidal wave of requests. The SARS systems aren't going to be able to handle that sheer volume as much as they say they are prepared for it. It's probably going to go down. It'll probably take a day or two to right the ship, and then the process will happen again. So I think this initial sort of 3, 4, 5 month period is going to be very sort of question marky. You might get lucky and get it out in a couple of weeks. It could take 2 months. We simply don't know. So we are very much going into uncharted waters. And the best advice we can give people is to say, guys, please just don't expect this to happen overnight. It's very likely that it'll take some time.
Absolutely. Then just there is a few questions that we haven't got to. If you can just add your email addresses, we will respond to you in person if we haven't gotten to your question. Just Gareth, from your opinion, the value of financial advice in these cases, is it necessary to see a financial planner or advisor?
No, I certainly think so. I think, with a lot of the time we want to make decisions for a certain reasoning, and often our role is not to be a gatekeeper to money. Our role is to say, fine, what are you trying to achieve? What are your options? And let's work through each of those options. Where is it going to be best? What are the considerations we can take? What are the unintended consequences of doing this today? How's it going to affect me tomorrow? That's really where the planning and advice comes in. And our role is to make sure that we've worked through all those scenarios with you. We've given you all the options and the potential outcomes so that you can make an informed decision. We're not here to explicitly tell you yes or no. Our role is to basically help you make good decisions.
Absolutely. And if you do not have a financial planner or financial advisor at this point, remember that you can go to FBI My Money 123's website, click on Find a Financial Planner, and all the practicing financial professionals that is registered with FBI, so you'll get a designated member, are listed there. You can search by your area that you're in. You can search by name. There's all kinds of options. Find a financial planner and make an appointment and speak it through before you actually make the call. We can't overstate the value of financial advice. So, Gareth, I want to say thank you so much for your time. I think it's been very informative. There is loads of questions that are coming through that are really interesting. So I really think we can go on for another 2 hours, but everybody hasn't got all that time. Please send your emails or put your name in the chat if you have any further questions. And Rihanna did post a link to a survey. If you can just complete that for us, it won't take you 2 minutes. That would be lovely. Thank you so much, Gareth.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for your time this morning.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.